The Arizona court system, there are a number of different courts in Arizona. Our court system goes back many years, actually goes back to statehood. So let's talk about these different courts that, as a business person, you may find yourself in on behalf of your company at one time or another. We'll start with some of the lower courts, the courts of limited jurisdiction. The municipal court, some people refer to this as a city court, is a court that exists in every city and town in the state. Now, when you're dealing in areas, when you're running a business, be aware of whether you're in a city or town or not. For example, Sun City is called a city, but it's not a city, it's not a town, it's unincorporated. That means that there is no city council, there is no police, there are no courts, no city courts. It's simply an area out in the county. So if you go to Sun City, you're not going to see the Sun City Police because they don't exist. You'll see the county sheriff's office responsible for public safety. And so if the municipality is small, it will be a town such as Tolleson or Litchfield Park. And as the town grows, eventually it will become a city like Peoria or Glendale or Phoenix. If your business is within a city or a town, if there is a criminal matter that's a misdemeanor, that will be that will be dealt with by the municipal court. If it's not a misdemeanor, if it's a felony, it will not be held in municipal court. For example, some DUIs are misdemeanors, some are not. It depends on the severity and depends on a number of different factors. But many first-time DUIs are misdemeanors, and those will be tried in a municipal court. And typically, those trials last 2, maybe 3 days. And if the defendant's found guilty, they're usually looking at a 10-day sentence. If it's a relatively, if there's nobody's hurt, it's not extreme, it's the first time, that sort of thing. They'll handle other crimes such as simple assaults, any kind of relatively minor crime that's a misdemeanor. In Arizona, all or virtually all drug cases are felonies, so you're not going to see those in municipal court. The municipal court also takes care of traffic matters in the city. Most, not all, but most traffic tickets are civil. And so if a person gets a traffic ticket and they're in a city or municipality, they're end up in the city court where they can either plead responsible and pay the fine, or if they want a trial, they can have a trial and have a hearing on it. Those are the two types of cases that municipal courts handle. The judges are lawyers who are basically city employees or hired by the city. There'll be typically, not always, but typically there'll be a city prosecutor involved in these cases. There always will be a city prosecutor involved in a criminal case, not necessarily traffic cases. And the courts are handled pretty much the way you would imagine a court to be handled. They handle a huge volume of cases. It's a lot of cases because most of these cases are never actually tried. They're just pled out, or the people just pay the fines and don't bother to contest them. The other type of court that's a court of limited jurisdiction is a justice of the peace court. Every county has one or more of these. I think Maricopa County, we have like 20. There's a lot of justice of the peace courts. They handle matters outside the city, and they also handle certain matters in the city. For example, if you get a traffic ticket and you're not in a city or a town, you're going to probably end up in a justice of the peace court, and they'll handle traffic tickets there. They also do certain types. They also handle certain types of criminal proceedings. For example, if the prosecutor decides to they want to charge somebody with a crime, they may seek what's known as a preliminary hearing, in which evidence is taken to determine whether or not there should be an indictment. And those are oftentimes handled in a justice of the peace court. Justice of the peaces will also issue search warrants. So they handle a number of types of criminal proceedings to take some of the load off the superior court. Justice of the peaces are interesting. It's very old school because the JPs are elected. They're not appointed, and they don't have to be lawyers. They just have to basically be, 18 years old and can read and speak English. Very low standards, and then they run for office. So in the election coming up, you'll see signs out for people running for justice of the peace. They also handle landlord-tenant. A lot of landlord-tenant cases come before the justice of the peace. So if a tenant doesn't pay their rent, the landlord will put a notice on the door or send them a notice, say, hey, your rent's overdue, get it caught up. And if the rent's not caught up, then and the person doesn't move out voluntarily, the tenant doesn't move out voluntarily, the landlord will file a forcible entry and detainer case, usually in the justice of the peace. And there'll be a hearing there. Usually the tenant doesn't even show up. But if the tenant feels like they have a defense, they'll show up and have a trial on the matter. If the tenant loses and still refuses to leave, then the constable, who's actually also an elected court employee, the constable will come out and remove the tenant from the apartment. And so the Justice of the Peace handles a lot of these relatively small cases that the Superior Court just can't handle. It's a very high volume type of court. The next court we're going to talk about is the Court of General Jurisdiction. Every state has one of these. They go by different names. Some states call them district courts, some call them circuit courts. Arizona, we call it the Superior Court, the Arizona Superior Court. And the Arizona Superior Court is a court that handles a wide variety of cases. As a general rule, and there are exceptions, but as a general rule, most any kind of case you might want to file could be filed in the Superior Court. There's some cases they can't handle, but not very many. That's why the term general jurisdiction is used. So what are the most common cases you would see in the Superior Court? Well, first off, their most common cases are civil cases. This is a wide array of possible cases. One of the more common cases they handle down there are cases involving traffic accidents, where a plaintiff is injured and claims that it's a defendant's fault, and the plaintiff is seeking damages. Now, you have to distinguish these cases from the cases handled in the municipal court. In the municipal court, these are based on traffic tickets that are issued by a police officer, and those go to municipal court. But if a person injured in an accident thinks the defendant's at fault, he'll file a lawsuit and seek money. Those are not going to be handled in the municipal court. Those will be handled usually in the Superior Court. And so if it's an accident and there's an injury and the parties can't work it out of court, they'll file a civil action. Of course, there are many more cases handled civilly than just traffic accidents, breaches of contracts, real estate disputes, who owns property, title disputes, these disputes between shareholders and members of the board of directors, many types of employment cases where, not all, but many types of employment cases where an employee is suing an employer for damages. Those can all be handled as a civil case in the Superior Court. The other large type of case that's handled, a common type of case that's handled in the Superior Court, are criminal cases. If the case is a misdemeanor, it's probably going to be heard in the municipal court. But if the case is a felony, it cannot be held in the municipal court. It's going to be held in the Superior Court. And there are quite a few judges here in Maricopa County that handle nothing but criminal cases. And they're assisted by commissioners. Commissioners are similar to judges. They're not strictly speaking judges, but they handle more routine matters that the judges don't get involved with. For example, in many of these criminal cases, the cases are pled out. The defendant and the prosecutor get together, they reach an agreement, and they'll bring it before the court. A lot of the proceedings involved in these plea deals are not going to be heard by a judge. Some are, some aren't. But many of the more routine matters in the criminal case are held by commissioners, and the commissioners handle routine work on behalf of the judges. So every imaginable felony would be handled in the Superior Court, and we'll talk about the criminal court later. The juvenile court is a court when minors get into, there's again a couple of things that the juvenile court does, but one of the more common things they do is they handle juveniles that get into criminal trouble. So a 15-year-old boy is in the back of a car, and the car is involved in some kind of crime, and the police come out and arrest everybody. Maybe there's some adults in the car, and they'll take the adults down to the city jail to be processed. The juvenile will be processed through the juvenile system, and the juvenile system is designed to, if possible, um, get the juvenile help so that he doesn't have to go, he doesn't have to be incarcerated. So it's its own little world out there. It's out in West Durango, and they have several judges and commissioners that just deal with these juvenile cases. In some circumstances, when the juvenile's older and it's a serious crime, the juvenile court judge will just send the juvenile over to the adult side, the adult criminal side, and it'll be tried there. But if the child is younger, or perhaps the crime is not as serious, they'll handle it themselves. They'll appoint an attorney, perhaps appoint a social worker, and try to come up with a resolution of the matter that protects society but also protects the juvenile. The next one is family law. There's probably 6 or 7 judges and quite a few commissioners that handle family matters, most common of which, of course, would be divorce, but they handle child custody matters and child support matters. An awful lot of cases down there where typically mom is getting some kind of entitlement, and dad's not paying child support, and there's a whole court system to try to find out who dad is and get him to pay child support so you can get mom off food stamps and entitlements. So there's a whole array of family type issues that are handled in family court. Probate court, they handle a number of cases there. They do what are known as guardians and conservatorships. When a person is unable to take care of their affairs, the courts might appoint a guardian to assist the incapacitated person, or perhaps appoint a conservator to handle the funds of the incapacitated person or the protected person. The probate court also handles the financial estates of decedents. When a person dies, in some cases, his assets have to be passed on. The creditors have to be paid off, and any remaining assets passed on to family members or people specified in the will of the decedent, and the probate court administers that process. And finally, there's a tax court judge who does just that. Tax issues, a lot of property tax issues are dealt there. So the Superior Court, as you can see, has a large array of possible cases that they deal with. We generally refer to the Superior Court as a court of original jurisdiction. What that means is that they handle the case when it's initially filed. Now, the Superior Court can also handle some appeals. Appeals from the Justice of the Peace Court, for example, are typically taken to the Superior Court. So in that case, the Superior Court has appellate review of the lower courts. But most of the cases that are heard in the Superior Court are original. They're filed in the Superior Court first, and then if a party wants to appeal, they appeal from the Superior Court. The next course we're going to talk about the appellate courts. There's 2 in Arizona, 2 primaries. There's the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. If a litigant at a lower level, typically at the Superior Court, feels like a serious error has been made by a trial court judge, they can appeal the case to the Court of Appeals. Primarily, what the appellant is claiming on appeal is that the trial court judge made a relatively serious error that the Court of Appeals has to rectify. Disputes on factual findings are usually not appealable. So if the jury determines a factual issue, for example, they determine that the traffic light was green rather than red, once the jury makes that finding a fact, in most cases, those factual determinations are not subject to appeal. The Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court won't listen to the appeal. What the Court of Appeals is really looking for are relatively serious errors made by the trial court judge that affected the fairness of the proceedings. If the Court of Appeals determines that a serious error was made, they can reverse the case, they can send the case back down for a new trial, which is relatively common. Most of the time when these cases are appealed, most of the time the decision by the trial court is upheld. But as we'll see in Lucy versus Zemmer, that's not always the case. In Lucy versus Zemmer, the appellate court decided that a serious error was made and reversed the trial court judge. If the whoever loses at the Court of Appeals, if they're unhappy, they can request that it be taken to the Supreme Court. Now, I say request because they're going to seek a person appealing to the Supreme Court, the party appealing to the Supreme Court, will request what's called a writ of certiorari. It's a request for the Supreme Court to hear the appeal. Unlike the Court of Appeals, where a litigant has a right to appeal, there is generally, and there are some exceptions, but there is generally no right to appeal to the Supreme Court. You have to request it. In most cases, the Supreme Court will say no. So for the typical case, the Court of Appeals is as far as the case is going to go, because generally the Supreme Court will not hear the appeal. The types of case that the Supreme Court hears are cases where there's an important impact on the state of Arizona. What the Court of Appeals is looking for is to ensure that the parties got a fair trial at the Superior Court. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, is more concerned with making good law for the entire state of Arizona. So they're looking for a case that would make good precedent for the future. And whereas the Court of Appeals has 3 judges, the Supreme Court in Arizona has 5 justices. Now, the actual proceedings in the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court are quite similar. Remember, they don't retry the case. What they do is they review the record at the Superior Court level. They review the record. So the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court don't have trials. There are no juries. They don't call witnesses. There's no evidence presented. Instead, at that level, they listen to the arguments of the attorneys. They review the record that was made at the Superior Court level, and then they make their ruling. The last course we want to talk about, and we have a whole chapter devoted to administrative law, are administrative courts. And there are many, many administrative courts. So the best example is MVD, Motor Vehicle Department. If the Motor Vehicle Department wishes to, say, suspend your driver's license because you've had so many tickets, you're going to go before the Motor Vehicle Department. They have a number of judges down there, and they'll have a trial. There's no jury in these courts. You present evidence, and they look over the evidence you present. They look over the evidence before them. They typically, a police officer, for example, might be at one of these courts, and then they make a decision whether your license should be, say, suspended or revoked or whatever the case may be. So there are many, many of these administrative courts. As a general rule, if you wish to appeal an administrative ruling, you can do so, and you end up either in the Superior Court or the Court of Appeals, depending on what type of administrative court it is and what type of hearing they heard. Now, we've just focused right now on state courts. Remember that states all have their own court system. For example, Texas has what's called county courts. Arizona doesn't have any county courts. So it's a different system. We have no county courts at all, whereas many states do. So what you may know about courts of other states won't necessarily apply outside that state.